Hello, it's Ren Presents time. I'm your host, Ren, and today we continue with the Belmont Saga, Part 1, Chapter 8, the Westminster. So last week, after getting the Seeker out of its critical situation in orbit, stopping the wingtip roll, and lifting the chin high enough to get it from kissing the atmosphere and plunging in like a fiery comet, Paymaster Stenstrom, Tara, and Aram settle in a little bit into the bridge. They manage to shunt in some power, and by denying gravity to various parts of the ship, they get a little air moving with a ventilator and get a few lights dimly working, a few backup systems, including a backup comm, working on the bridge. So that's a positive first step compared to the creepy, howling, groaning environs of the rest of the ship. The bridge seems like a nice, safe haven from all that bullshit. So, as they orbit, now safe from plunging into the atmosphere, they get a comm from Lieutenant Gwendolyn, who's the commander of the Damophalon John scouting ship, the ship that has been dispatched by the nefarious Admiral Derleth to board the ship, pull it out of its list, and thereby cause Paymaster Stenstrom to lose his seat and his cash. Gwendolyn, though polite, it is really just spells it out, says, hey, I'm sorry, I'm gonna cost you your position, but your situation is my responsibility at the moment, so I'm coming aboard regardless of the ramifications. We're gonna tow the Seeker to dry dock, and then we're gonna take you and Aram and Tara down to the fleet, where Tara will be arrested for being AWOL, and Aram will be returned to Admiral Derleth's office. The Admiral is willing to forget these doings. He just wants Aram back safe and sound. So the Admiral, despite being a gruffster, does have a lot of feelings and compassion for Aram, his secretary. They give tit for tat, one thing leads to another, and they get into a passive-aggressive argument where Paymaster Stenstrom says, well, you're not coming aboard my ship. I'm fulfilling my mission. I'm taking this crappy brandy to Baz. That's it, period, end of story. And she says, well, I am boarding your ship. I am taking command. I'm arresting Private Tara. And there's nothing you can do about it. And if you don't like it, we can go to the gym and do a few rounds. And she starts ordering Aram around, and he's used to following orders, so he starts doing what she asks. Stenstrom tells him to show a bit of style and buckle up, and the argument continues until Gwendolyn is good and mad. They meet her hospitaller, Lady Morgan Jutterix of Thompson, who is concerned that they're having brain asphyxia, but their life support is okay for the time being. So that's where they are. They've got 7 hours to get away from Cana and away from Lieutenant Gwendolyn, and they do not want her setting a foot aboard the ship. So what are they going to do? They're in a half-scuttled ship. They have no propulsion whatsoever. But Tara remembers seeing a message come across the desk down at the fleet that there is a TAC scout ship in dry dock getting refitted called the Westminster, and if they were to appropriate the Westminster and tie it down in Ripcard Bay 5, which is the only one large enough to accommodate a ship like the Westminster, they could use it as a drive engine to blast their way from Cana. Only problem is Ripcard Bay 5 faces the front of the ship instead of the stern, so they're going to have to fly backwards, but who cares? At least they're moving. So that's where we are. We are almost at the end of Part 1, The Admiral's Pleasure. This chapter is only a few pages long. And then there's one more chapter after that, known as Stop the Seeker. And then after that, we move into Part 2, All That Resists Him. And depending on how I'm feeling, either we stop after these 4 pages and then do Stop the Seeker in its own recording, or I'll just add it onto this one. I can only be in this unmonetized state for so long, you see. So let's proceed here. Part 1, Chapter 8, the Westminster. Let's knock this out, and then see how things go, and then we might read Chapter 9, Stop the Seeker. Slowly, the Seeker ascended several thousand feet. If the various sensors and automated equipment on the bridge had been functioning, they'd have been hearing all sorts of klaxons and buoys complaining about proximity violations and the like. However, the Seeker's bridge was blissfully quiet. Soon, on the jumpy hollow cone, the ribcage of Dry Dock 275 appeared in the distance. It was mostly empty. The only ship within was the tiny, bullet-shaped hull of the Westminster. Carefully, Aram slid the Seeker into the aft docking collar, and the three of them made their slow way out of the ship. The clean, fresh air and bright lights of the dry dock was a real treat after the darkness and stale, smelly air they had been breathing. They were met by a single Marine and an angry yardmaster. "Didn't you get my comm? You're in the wrong dry dock. The Seeker's scheduled to make berth in dry dock 186 a few days hence. You need to get your tub out of here now." "Actually, sir, I'm sorry. What is your name?" Stenstrom said. "Senior Yardmaster Pirro." "I see. Well, Senior Yardmaster Pirro, we're not staying, obviously. We're just here to pick up the Westminster. Her presence is required on Baths for a few days, and then we'll have her right back just like we found her." Pirro was dumbfounded. "Taking the Westminster? First I've heard of it. The Westminster is scheduled after her refit to go to Tantan, serve the fleet office there. I'm gonna get thee some confirmation. Sergeant Laval, would you mind so much?" The Marine drew his SK and pointed it at them. "I'd get your hands up in plain sight and keep them there if I were you. Right now," Pirro said, walking into his office. Stenstrom smiled and raised his hands. "Oh, indeed." He glanced at Aram and Tara. "Come on, you two, get your hands up. Let's all be friends, shall we?" Aram and Tara raised their hands. The Marine reached out and took Tara's SK. Then he pulled Stenstrom's nth pistols and set them aside. "I'm sorry about this," he said. "I'm certain it's just a mix-up. It happens all the time." "Yes, just a mix-up. Sergeant, you forgot something," Stenstrom said. Sir," the Marine responded. Stenstrom waved his fingers, and a pink holy stone appeared in his hand. "Holy stone," he said. "I always carry a bunch." "Well, thank you, sir," the Marine replied. He reached up and took the stone. He instantly fell into a rather stupefied state. He toppled over, and Stenstrom caught him and eased him down. "Pink holy stone works every time. You'll have a nice little dream, Sergeant, then you'll be just fine." Tara put her hands down and walked into the yardmaster's office. There was a struggle from within. Somebody hit the floor with a crash. Stenstrom and Aram came in. Tara was dragging the yardmaster's unconscious body away from his chair. "Tara, was knocking this man out really necessary?" "Yes, Belle, it was. He's fine. He'll just have to live with the notion that he got knocked the hell out by a girl is all. I'm certain that's not a little tidbit he'll be sharing with his friends anytime soon." Stenstrom produced another pink holy stone and stuck it in Pirro's hand. They then scoured the dry dock, looking for anything they might have a use for. They found several crates of Insta-meals, which they loaded onto the Westminster, along with a few boxes of bottled water, 4 pressure suits with 10 hours of air each, 3 portable generators, 2 hollow terms, a Macon air condenser, a Havelock mag system along with yards of cabling, and some hand tooling, should it be needed. They then piled into the Westminster and Aram fired it up. The transport was rather bullet-shaped with a fairly spacious cargo area and pilot's seat. Aram strapped himself into the pilot's chair and pressed buttons on the organ-like panels in front of him. "Oh, after the suborbital and the Seeker's dead helm, this is like flying a dream," he raved as he pulled away from the dock. "These old air engines aren't good for much, but they'll generate a lot of work-heavy thrust. We'll break orbit no problem once we get her strapped down." Tara was amazed. "How do you know how to do all this stuff? Got another Molly on you somewhere?" "No," he laughed. Lots and lots of unlogged time in the simulators. I'm up on all of these old ships. I used to go in them every day and escape out the French hatch when somebody came in. I would have gotten in loads of trouble if they caught me in there. He looked at Tara's dangling molochs. May I? Oh, sure. Tug away. Aram reached over and gave her 2 quick tugs on the sideburns. That's the spirit. See, this is fun. I love you guys already. They had the foresight to pre-open the doors on Ripcar Bay 5, and Aram carefully slid the Westminster in. It was a tight fit. They then donned their newly acquired pressure suits and went out. They hard-docked the Westminster's landing skids and bolted her down as tightly as they could. Tara, still using the Molly with abandon, ran a controller cable from the central node of the transport to a junction nearby. This way, she explained over the suit's comm. We'll have control over the ship from the bridge and not have to have somebody actually in the Westminster doing the flying. It took a while, bumbling around in her pressure suit, but she finally got it set up. Tara also connected several power cables to the Westminster's generators and shunted the power, allowing the Seeker to make use of it. Their task done, they gathered their booty from the dry dock and collected it in a cargo net. They then did a short spacewalk to the adjacent Ripcar Bay where they manually entered. Well, Tara said, getting out of her pressure suit, her short black hair a mess. That dry dock was like a big old grocery store, wasn't it? Look at all the stuff we just stole. This is great. We're going to need to be getting out of here post-haste. The pinky should be wearing off on those 2 shortly, Stenstrom said. Well, you're just pissing people off left and right today, aren't you, Belle? She added. They returned to the bridge and set up 2 of the generators. It took a while, hoisting them up the empty lift shaft with ropes until Tara had a bright idea to cut the gravity in the area, allowing the heavy equipment to float up. That was some inspired stuff. The lights came on and the whole place seemed a tad cheerier. They also set up the Macon and it began producing fresh, clean air. Aram took the helm and Stenstrom ordered the Seeker backed out of the dry dock. The Westminster fired and off they went. And with that, we conclude Part 1, Chapter 8, The Westminster. So we see Stenstrom and his jolly band of pirates sneaking on to Dry Dock 275, knocking out the skeleton crew and making off with the Westminster and a whole lot of goodies that might make their trip to Baz a little more comfortable. They've got some food now, they've got some water, they've got a little air device, and they've got the Westminster that can generate power that Tara can use to apply it to various parts of the ship using her mollied up intellect. It all in all is a good deal. And using the Westminster as an engine, managed to escape Cana's orbit, and they are now on their way at a very slow speed backwards to Bass. So that was Chapter 8, very short as I promised. So, do I want to continue and read? Do I want to continue and read? The Magic 8 Ball says definitely so. So, let's carry on. This is the final chapter in Part 1. Chapter 9, Stop the Seeker. And then we will be in Part 2, All That Resists Him. And that's a very different chapter than this one. This one is all plot, basically, moving the plot forward. We're going to be getting out of the plot for quite a bit in Part 2. And that's where I took it on the chin in the review areas a little bit. Some people didn't mind. Some people enjoyed this foray into Paymaster Stenstrom's past, where all his secrets are discussed and revealed. But some hated it. They're like, I was interested in the plot, had a good thing going, and then we just stop. And you start talking about this fool and his backstory. That's just how I wanted to conduct the story. I wanted to give Stenstrom a lot of secrets and then take them away, and then give you a glimpse into his backstory, who he is. We've been hearing about his mother, his departed mother, quite a bit. We're going to see her a lot in Part 2. Why he became a paymaster, how he how he learned the sorceress skills, yada yada yada. So we have that to look forward to in Part 2. But first, let's get to it. Part 1, the final chapter, Chapter 9, Stop the Seeker. Aboard the Demophalon John, Lieutenant Gwendolyn walked through the tight corridors of the ship, and headed to her quarters. Her crew, though efficient and polite, gave her plenty of space as she prowled the halls. Nobody said anything to her as she passed by either. They sunk into the walls, trying to be quiet and unnoticed. Yesterday was St. Porter's Day. She would have forgotten altogether, but she overheard several of her crew wishing each other well. Nobody gave her the happy Porter's Day greeting. Nobody wanted to get on her bad side or risk provoking the grizzly bear, the snapping turtle, the angry mountain. That's what the crew called her. She'd heard all the various names whispered in the mess and in the corridors. Her crew, in short, was quite terrified of Lieutenant Gwendolyn, Lady of Prentice. Not only was she mean as a snake and pugnacious to boot, she had the connections in the Admiralty to really make things unpleasant for the poor junior officer or crewman. There were all sorts of rotten duties and crap postings awaiting just such an unfortunate soul. She was even known to K-list crew for even minor offenses, sending them and their careers into pure fleet purgatory that few ever emerged from. The closest thing she had to a friend was Morgan Jetterix, the ship's hospitaller, and why not? Being a hospitaller, Morgan was immune to the captain's fits of temper and threats of detail and demotion. And though the crew had never seen such a thing, Morgan Jetterix could probably outfight Lieutenant Gwendolyn if push came to shove. Nobody could fight like a hospitaller. But even with Morgan Jetterix, their professional relationship was off and on. They certainly didn't do much together during their off hours. Gwendolyn didn't approve of Morgan's rather flashy habits. Clearly, nobody really liked Lieutenant Gwendolyn much. And she wondered why sometimes. Sure, she demanded a lot from her crew. Sure, she went by the book. Sure, she could have a hot temper and sometimes went off at the mouth, but many captains did, and they had the love of their crew. Why didn't she? Why didn't she have a friend aboard? Why did she eat her meals alone and spend all of her free time in her quarters? She opened the door to her small cabin and stepped in. She removed her hat and let her long coffee-brown hair out of its confining bun. She took off her gun belt and hung it from a peg, her family fedula, long and rapier-like, glinting in the soft light. Her feet were killing her. She pulled off her fleet boots that went up to her knees and took a seat. She'd had a long day. She looked around. Being the captain of a Tekle-class scout ship, her quarters were the largest on the ship, yet they were rather small, just big enough for a table, a bathroom, a small bed, and still, they were quite luxurious compared to what everybody else got bunked in. She didn't need a whole lot of room, though. Her quarters were shockingly sterile and devoid of personal mementos and decorations. A cold room for a well-known cold person. She liked many of the ancient card games that were once played and was quite good at them. She had several handmade, hand-painted decks that were worth quite a bit of money. They were her most prized and sentimental possessions, beyond her fedula, given to her by her grandfather. She knew by heart dozens of games, but mostly she played solitary ones. Nobody wanted to sit down and play a hand of cards with the grizzly bear. Might get eaten. She took out one of her decks and sat down at the table, shuffling the cards around. She dealt 8 cards for herself and 8 for a person across the table who wasn't there. Her lonely thoughts began to spin. Paymaster Stenstrom, Lord of Belmont. She understood how the Paymaster felt. Her mission, on the orders of Admiral Derleth himself, will cost him his chair. He had rubbed the Admiralty the wrong way during his appointment, and they were going to make him suffer for it. He wouldn't be the first person they cheated out of a captain's chair. Stenstrom, Lord of Belmont. That was a name she heard from time to time growing up in the House of Prentice. When her aunt, a thin, unsmiling woman, came for a visit, she would sit in the parlor and talk with venom about someone named Stenstrom, Lord of Belmont, and his mother, a woman whom her aunt hated above all others. The words her aunt spoke were ugly and cold, driven by a confined, animal-like fury, all directed at some woman from Tyrol and her son. And then many times her aunt called out for her in a callow voice, "Gwendolyn!" And she didn't want to go in her presence. She was frightened of her aunt, but was drawn and couldn't help herself. "Gwendolyn, come here!" Sometimes she heard that voice in her nightmares. "Gwendolyn!" Many times she was stopped halfway by her uncle, Derleth. "Come on, Gwen, let's go outside and get some air. Or let's put the gloves on and go a round or two. Show me what you got." Many times her uncle saved her from having to go before her aunt. Occasionally he wasn't there to help her, and she had to go in and see her aunt. She remembered seeing the thin, bent form sitting in the parlor waiting for her. She never remembered what happened after that. It was blacked out in her mind. So there he was, Paymaster Stenstrom, a man with enemies all over the place. She wondered if he was aware of all the various people who hated him from afar. Gwendolyn didn't hate him. As a girl, she harbored a vague curiosity about the fellow. What he was like, how he looked, what had he done to deserve his aunt's considerable scorn? She was certain he was only a year or two older than she was. He was just a little boy as her aunt spewed her venom. What could he possibly have done? No, she didn't hate him at all. But she had her orders to take him into custody. Unlike the commander of a warbird like the Seeker, a scout ship captain had to follow orders from the Admiralty. She had no choice. She was under orders, but that didn't mean she had to like them. She had the whole thing pictured out in her head. After she'd accomplished her mission, she had planned to take Paymaster Stenstrom to a quiet cafeteria at the fleet. There was one in the western wing of the complex that she favored. Sit him down at a quiet table and explain. He would no doubt be rather surly, possibly pouting and nostalgic. She had imagined herself being unusually patient and accommodating, listening to Lord Belmont cry in his beer. Since he had been personally sponsored by the great Captain Davidge, a man respected by all, then he must be of good quality. He had to be. She planned to stick up for him, to come charging to his rescue and offer him help. She'd read Davidge's report regarding Lord Stenstrom's performance during the Kestrel affair. He did very well indeed, so apparently he was cut from command cloth. Surely some ship out there in the whole of the fleet could use such a fellow. Maybe not a warbird, maybe something smaller, but she planned to help him in any way she could. She wondered how her aunt would react to such a display. Probably not very well, though Gwendolyn frankly didn't care about her aunt. She was no longer a frightened child, and this was none of her aunt's business. She imagined herself with all sorts of questions sitting there in the cafeteria with him. A drab cafeteria in the middle of the fleet could hardly have been considered a romantic place, but in her practical and undecorated mind, it might as well have been a garden full of roses. Just she and the paymaster, sitting with their trays, absorbed in discovering each other. Her questions were many. So why a paymaster? Why didn't he simply join the fleet? He wears a Hoban Royal Navy coat, so he must have some hankering for it, some longing. Why did he choose such an odd route? And why the mask? Was he simply an eccentric lord from Belmont? Was he scarred? Or was there some other reason for wearing it? Why? She wondered what he looked like without it, just like one of those cleverly wrapped presents she used to get on Nether Day, one that was obscured just enough to keep her from knowing what it was, to whet one's appetite to get it unwrapped to find out what was underneath. Her fantasy continued. As the lunch went on, she had planned to tell him that she would do what she could to help him reappoint to another ship. She wanted to make amends, and he would see reason and accept, warmly shaking her hand, and then she would get out her decks and push their trays aside, and they'd play cards. They'd play for hours, both of them laughing and talking with abandon, the cards going fnap, fnap on the tabletop. In her mind, she had Paymaster Stenstrom, Lord of Belmont, the man in the mask and the HRN coat, penciled in as a friend, perhaps more. Surely he, like her, was a misfit too. But then, of course, the grizzly bear struck. He annoyed her during their initial meeting. Worse, he infuriated her. Yes, I can see that. The heavyweight division. What a cruel thing to say in front of her crew. Morgan laughed, everybody laughed, and of course, she saw red and went off at the mouth. What had she expected from him? Her mission was to remove him of his brand new command, and the idyllic and fanciful lunch shared in the fleet cafeteria that she had hoped for began to seem more and more impossible. Now, after her performance earlier, she committed herself to getting into a brawl with him, and all the goodwill she'd built up in her mind was temporarily forgotten. She had been furious. If she could have, she would have fought him right there and then. That's the temper again. That's the willingness to attempt bodily harm upon another. Getting into a fight with Paymaster Stenstrom, whether the man could properly defend himself or not, it hadn't mattered to her, and maybe her crew was right to be afraid of her after all. She was a apprentice, a long-standing noble family from Xenon, their holdings not too terribly far from the ancestral Belmont holdings in the more southern city of Brinthia, if she wasn't mistaken. Unlike other Xenon girls who tended to be quite petite, ladies from Prentice were large in stature, not fat or overweight, just broad-shouldered, tall, and dense. Gwendolyn had 6 sisters, all like her, but of all of them, she was the biggest and probably had the most vile temper and sharpest tongue. Her tongue, in fact, had knocked her right out of the prolific Xenon social scene that her sisters participated so readily in. Though not very old, she was already considered a spinster. Most of the eligible lords looking for a lady denounced Gwendolyn of Prentice as not worth the trouble, and they conducted their search in less volatile pastures. Such fiery ladies were often known as Black Widows in League society. Vith ladies were often labeled Black Widows, and sometimes Barrows and Calverts, but almost never Xenons. Sometimes Black Widows were a commodity, interested gentlemen occasionally finding them alluring and irresistible, like hunting for a dangerous animal that could lash out and bite. Yet in her case, her stature and undeniably volcanic nature kept even the most brave at bay. Fortunately for her, getting married wasn't foremost in her mind. She wanted to educate herself and become something other than a trophy wife on display at a grand sitting room other Xenon girls dreamed of being. She saw the League around her and wanted to participate, to make her mark and leave an impression. She went to school in Arden, earning an EV degree as an engineer of stellar mechanics, the only Xenon girl in her class. She did, in fact, have a solid head on her shoulders. She was also a favorite of one of her uncles on her mother's side, Lord Derleth of Cone, an admiral in the Stellar Fleet, the younger brother of the mean old aunt she and her sisters were so afraid of. He always thought Gwendolyn had a good head and a stout heart, top among her sisters, though she clearly needed to work on her manners and her social skills. Like most of the Cones, her uncle had the sort of domineering personality that put a stopper on her temper, squelched it before it could top off and really come to a boil. And he genuinely appeared to be fond of his niece. He was patient with her, guiding her throughout her formative years. As an outlet for her energy and to help teach her discipline and respect, he introduced her to contact sports, which wasn't a pursuit proper Xenon girls usually chose to indulge in, but Gwendolyn was certainly not a standard Xenon girl. She took up boxing at first, and she had an immediate talent for it. Her size and density were a big help. So her uncle took her to Onaris every year to compete, and she won a number of tournaments there over time. He helped her gain admission to the fleet and guided her quickly through the ranks, Gwendolyn eventually becoming the commanding officer of a scouting ship under his direct command, though engineering appeared to be her true calling. After guiding the Demophalon John for a few years, she should easily appoint as either an engineer or captain for some main fleet vessel. She'd heard that he did quite a lot for her behind the scenes, managing to push aside some of the less flattering notes that began bubbling up regarding her behavior. Unruly, ill-mannered, bad temper, few command intangibles, and disliked by her crew. "Not to worry, Gwen," he often told her. "Leave it all to me." After she had time to cool off and reflect, she once again found herself admiring this man whom most of the Admiralty wished to see fail, this upstart paymaster from Tyrol who freebooted his way onto the chair of a main fleet vessel. Look what he'd accomplished. He'd been able to get aboard an abandoned ship in orbit using a suborbital craft, and he had managed to get 2 total strangers to help him along the way at great risk to themselves. She wondered if she could have done such a thing, if she could have gotten anyone to assist her in such a fashion, and she rather doubted it. She looked at the cards across the table. I'm sorry for today. I'd hoped to get off on a better footing. Friends? She said hopefully. As she sat there waiting for the cards to answer, her comm chattered. "Com," she said in a husky voice. "Com here, Captain. Message from the fleet, Admiral Derleth." "Aye, Com, I'll take it in here." She took a moment, straightened her hair, and accepted the message. On her comm screen, the stern, iron-haired image of Admiral Derleth appeared. "Evening, sir," she said. "Well met." The Admiral didn't mince words. "Gwendolyn, there has been a change in plans regarding the Seeker." The Admiral was always very informal with her. He was her uncle, after all. She was elated. "I see. We were at 3 hours, 22 minutes until our link-up with her, sir. The Seeker is no longer in orbit around Cana." What?" "Yes, Paymaster Stenstrom and his band of pirates are cutting a notorious swath across the face of the League. It seems the good Paymaster took it upon himself to appropriate the tax scout ship Westminster from Dry Dock 275 and is using her as a drive engine. 2 hours ago, he broke orbit and is on a slow-speed course to Baz by way of Onaris." Gwendolyn absorbed the news. "I see," she said again. "In light of this development, your mission has changed. You are to intercept the Seeker, board her, and deliver Paymaster Stenstrom, Adjutant Josephus, Lord of Aram, and Marine Private Taradela Anderson back to fleet immediately. There they shall face any number of charges and fines. You are authorized to disable the Seeker in any manner you see fit to safely accomplish your mission, though I badge you to be mindful of fleet assets and protect them as best you can. I trust to your good judgment. Am I clear?" Gwendolyn's elation fell. "Admiral," she said, "I request that another perform this task. I do not feel up to it. There is no other that I trust for such a mission. We cannot tag out a main fleet warbird for this task, as it shall then be out of the Admiralty and a matter of public record. The Paymaster, should such a thing come out, might garner sympathy in the court of public opinion throughout the ranks and manage to get out of this situation enhanced. He might even find help, as no doubt his father or Captain Davidge or any other ship's captain with a saber to rattle would come to his aid should his plight become known. We must keep a tight lid on this, Gwendolyn. I want this matter kept on the hush, and I want that animal from Tyrol brought before me in irons. We want to rip that mask from his foolish Belmont face and tear that coat right off him. And for that, we need you." Who pray is we, Admiral?" "Never mind. Just get him here on the quick." She closed her eyes. "Admiral, what is to be done with Paymaster Stenstrom?" "Well, let's just be creative here for a moment. Stockade is an obvious punishment. Work detail. Throw him on the bag for all to gawk at. Possible imprisonment and censure from the fleet and the sisters are likely. And surely a date with a sonic lash would be in order." She sat there a moment. "Can I count on you, Gwen?" "Uncle, were you aware that Adjutant Josephus is an accomplished pilot?" "Josephus? My Josephus? Of course not. The man can barely see and is afraid of his own shadow. He often scares himself into a state with all the research he does on that fiend of Calvert maniac." "Well, apparently he can see well enough to fly a suborbital onto a wrecked ship in orbit. Apparently he has more skill and guts than you gave him notice for." "What does that have to do with your orders, Gwendolyn? When you bring Josephus back here, maybe I'll have a talk with him and flesh out these skills I did not know he had. Perhaps I can introduce him to the right folk. In any event, I need you to put this Paymaster's captaincy to a quick end. Again, I'll ask, can I count on you, Gwen?" She nodded. Yes, Uncle, of course." "That's a good lady. We'll speak again soon. Please be safe and ensure the unharmed return of Josephus and Private Tara. If you have to get rough with the paymaster, feel free. Just remember, I want that coat. Derleth out. And the screen went blank. Gwendolyn sat there for a moment. She sighed and collected the cards sitting on the table. She arranged them back into an orderly deck. "Calm," she said in her usual gruff voice. "Calm here, Captain. Calm, there's been a change in plans. The Seeker has broken orbit around Kane and is headed for Baz. We are to intercept her at once, board her, and return all persons within to fleet with all speed. Send a navigation and lay in an adjusted course." "Aye, ma'am. Also, inform the bosun I want the Christmas guns checked and made ready to be run out." The comm paused. "The guns, ma'am?" "Did I stutter?" "No, ma'am." "Are you incapable of following my orders?" "No, ma'am." "Then carry them out. I'll not repeat them, and I'll expect the bosun's report in short order." "Aye, ma'am." The comm went off. She sat there at the table. Outside, she could hear the occasional chattering of crewmen as they passed by. She looked at the empty chair on the other side of the table. There was nobody there, and probably never would be. That cafeteria at Fleet was, more and more, an idyllic place she could now never go. And with that, we conclude Part 1, Chapter 9. And we also conclude Part 1. So next week, we'll begin Part 2, All That Resists Him. And Chapter 1 in Part 2 is A Remarkable Birth. So you're going to see a downshift in tone. We get away from plot and we go into other places. And that's just how I chose to conduct this story. So yeah, I think it's interesting. Most people do, but some people gave me the high, hard one over it. So in any event, you have to have a tough skin. You have to let things roll off, and I certainly did, and I respect everyone's opinion. Not necessarily agree with it, but it is what it is. But I think it's good, and we'll see what you think going forward. It's becoming clear, or it should be, after this chapter, that I spoke previously of coincidences. And are these really coincidences, or are they something else? Are they meetings predefined or predetermined or inevitable in the greater scheme of things, that there is a closed circle that is tightening? And more, it's looking like this Lieutenant Gwendolyn coming in on her scouting ship is also part of this circle in one way or shape or form. She has known about Paymaster Stenstrom since he was a little boy, hearing her aunt, an aunt that she was terrified of, talking with her mother about this little boy in Tyrol and his mother, and how she hated the both of them, that she wished harm upon this little boy, that he was a vector or a route for her to get revenge for something, and she didn't know what. But her aunt apparently hated this Paymaster Stenstrom's mother to the point that she was going to use her son, Lord Belmont, Paymaster Stenstrom, to enact revenge for something, for some slight. And that sort of connection is deep-seated and hard to break, and so she's known of him for a long time. She is a very intelligent woman. She earned an EV degree from the University of Art and Engineering. That's not something that's easy to do. Yeah, she's got attitude problems. She's got a hot temper. She's not very socially skilled. She's got an uncle who can grease the wheels and fix things for her as she gets a lot of complaints into the Admiralty, and he takes care of them, makes them go away, just because she's kind of a unpleasant, unsociable commander. She's just not very comfortable with the command position, and she takes it out on her crew for her feelings of discomfort, or what? She's just kind of a mean person. Maybe if she wasn't in command, maybe if she was doing something that she had more of an affinity for, like engineering, she wouldn't be quite that harsh. But we're seeing more and more, especially with this chapter, that whatever circle that binds Stenstrom, Tara, and Aram, Lieutenant Gwendolyn is also in that circle, just as hard as they are, and things are drawing them together. So she is en route across space to his position, and if she were to step on aboard that ship, bad things might happen. The circle, whatever they're in, might close or come to a conclusion, and that might spell disaster for all four of them. So next week, we will continue with part 2, All That Resists Him, Chapter 1, A Remarkable Birth. So we will continue with the story, and we're going to find the tone of the story changing quite a bit. We go from the here and now into the plot that's been developing, and we sort of put that aside and learn a few things about Paymaster Stenstrom and the people around him. In any event, that's next week. Until then, this is Unmonetized Story Hour. This is Ren Presents. I'm your host, Ren. Peace out.